Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of Developing the Leader Within podcast. I'm Enrique, and today I have Mark with me. I've been waiting a long time to talk to this brother. But Mark, thank you for being with me today as we're talking leadership and human connection. And first of all, let me just start off with, before you get to the introduction of what you're doing, congratulations on all that you have been able to capitalize on up until today. I followed you on LinkedIn mostly, and I've been just impressed on how you can take from what you had and what you've created. And obviously, God has opened a lot of doors for you, and you've been able to capitalize that. So congratulations on that.
Thank
And
you.
and thank you for being with us.
Of course. Thank you so much, man. And thank you for creating this platform. And I'm super honored to be here.
Outstanding. So first, let's get a little bit of background on, and I could read your bio here. and
Yeah.
for a young man, it's pretty big, so I'm happy to do that. But I always love to hear from the guests, what you're doing, what
Yeah.
you're about, where you headed.
Yeah, man. So honestly, I think the best way that I've learned kind of how to describe myself is I spent every single day of my entire life trying to hide from the world. I literally spent every single day of my life, every day, it's not an exaggeration, every day of my life trying to not be myself, trying to hide myself, trying to hide from other people, and really just try to hide from the world, hide my story. I had no idea that I even had a story or I had any kind of significance or anything like that, or I could do any of these things that I'm doing now. And yet today, I do the opposite. Today, literally all I do is share with the world my stories, share with other people, help other people. And so it's kind of like like an oxymoron. It's kind of like some humor of like, I just kind of feel like God had me go through like this trial for the first part of my life where he was like, Mark, do you really want to be yourself? Mark, do you really want to be yourself? And every single day I tried to, but I just couldn't do it. I failed. And now that has put me in a position where I can't do anything but be myself, whether it's on a podcast, a book, in person. And so it's one of those things where it's like a superhero movie. Same thing with everyone. The superhero goes through their challenges that scars them, but then it also gives them their superpowers. And I'm no different. And so that's the best way I've found to describe myself.
Outstanding. Hey, before we started, we was having a conversation, and I was telling you, I said, out of all the good things that you've been able to do, the best thing you did was find yourself. That was the best. And it's the same for most people that we talk to. You on your platform, I'm on the leadership side. The best thing that people can do is just find themselves. But we're so into the hustle of the day to day that we just get inundated with things, ideas, conversations, sidetrack things, that we don't have that opportunity to just sit down and get a load of ourselves, right? Because that is where the true power comes. So I have mentioned to you this, but that was the best thing you did. And look at this, and we had a chuckle over my little slogan for you, but it's so true. You have this thing, and we'll talk about here your programming sometime during the conversation here. But taking somebody from shy to oh my, right?
Yeah.
It's amazing to see from you. And so let's talk a little bit about that book you wrote, because for a shy person to just say, hey, screw being shy, usually that sounds like a culmination of, hey, I already had enough. But tell us a little bit about the book, how you got there.
Yeah. So, honestly, I never really wanted to write a book. I was like, I'll write a book like 10 years from now when I'm older. But I had to write my book, Screw Being Shy, because I first got invited to be like a speaker in 2018. And in 2019, I was basically like speaking all around America. I spoke in like every major city in the US, and some other countries. And one of the craziest things that I experienced, Enrique, is that at the end of every single time that I spoke and I like talked about my life story and all these different things, there would always be at least one person who would walk up to me after the event or after I was finished speaking, and they would ask me the same exact question. They would say, and by the way, when they would walk up to me, maybe they wouldn't make direct eye contact with me. Maybe they would stutter a little bit, or maybe I could see like they were sweating or shaking or trembling, exactly how I used to be. And they'd ask me the same question. They say, "Hey, Mark, how did you go from someone who was like crippling shy, social anxiety, to being able to like go on a stage and talk about like your intimate life story in front of hundreds of people?" And so that kept on happening to me again and again and again and again. And I've overcome a lot of problems. I've overcome depression. I've overcome obesity. I've overcome suicide. I've overcome poverty. I've overcome a lot of different issues. But for me, one of the most interesting issues that I feel like I had to solve on my own in my own way was social anxiety, was like me literally unable to talk to people, literally me unable to be myself. And then therefore not really have the close relationships that I have today and not do what I wanted to do. Like I was originally studying like computer science. And so for me, that same kind of person would walk up to me again and again and again and again and again. And I was just like, wait, there are no books that really talk about this. There are some books that have been written by like clinical psychologists and some human behavior experts, and there are a couple of good ones. But I feel like the vast majority of them are too technical. They're too advanced, not really for like the average person to just read. And so I was like, I have to write this. Like I have to write this. And I remember like the night of, I couldn't go to sleep. And I just like I kept on going to sleep. And then in my head, I just see screw being shy, screw being shy, screw being shy. And so I remember that like the next day I was in LA and I was flying back to Boston, and I just spent that entire flight just like dumping down ideas, trying to figure out like, how can I write this to get this in the hands of people who were just like me, but don't know a way out. And they've tried other things. Like they've tried people that tell them, oh, just be confident, or just learn networking skills, or just do this, and it doesn't really work. And so I was like, I have to write this because it worked for me. And I'm going to go off my story. And I'm also going to go off like the science that adds some credibility and backs up like what's been studied, what's been measured, what's been experimented on in terms of people. So I just had to write this, man. I honestly didn't want to write a book. I don't think I'm a writer, although now I'm like, I understand I'm a writer. So it's very interesting, man, but I just had to write this book to get it out there.
Well, I tell you, we thank you for writing that book, because there's a lot of people that are not on the front. You know, they don't lead from the front. And we have mentioned not every leader is that, you know, charismatic, out in front, yelling and talking loud and initiating conversation. Not every leader is like that. And so I think that your book will just nicely marry their personality, because there's some leaders, and sometimes I'm one of those type of leaders that I'm a situational. So depending on the situation is what you're going to get from me, because I'm just aware of my surrounding. There's sometimes you just don't need to talk. You just need to sit there and listen. And so it's so I'm situational in that regard. And so I could be the shy, I can be the extrovert, you know, I could be the supporter, I could be the one cleaning the floor. I don't mind that myself. So
Nice.
so it's funny how we're heading into this leadership and human connection, because you had to get out of wherever it was that you were, right? Before this, you know, overnight, hey, this is what your book needs to sounds like. You had to get there. So what was the pivotal point, besides, you know, hey, you got to write this book, that allowed you to say, you know what, uh, I need to own myself. I need to say, you know what, Mark is a pretty cool guy. Yeah, you know, they and the world needs to get a hold of it.
Yeah. So personally speaking, it was really just me in 2015, just going through probably the worst year of my life. And for me, like growing up, I had always experienced social anxiety. But all of a sudden in 2015, my lifelong social anxiety transforms into like social isolation. I stopped talking to my family, my friends. I get seriously depressed for the first time in my life. I can't wake up in the morning. I can't go to sleep at night. I start, flirting with alcohol, substances, eating too much food. Next thing I know, I'm like obese. I've gained over 75, 80 pounds in a short period of time. And really, the best way, like it's crazy to think back at it now, but really the best way to describe it is my brain just straight up broke. And it was this time where it was like I had always felt lost just as a kid, not feeling accepted. But this is a time when in 2015 where it felt like even if I tried to be myself and I tried to step up, like my brain and my nervous system would hold me back. And so as a result, like I was just in so much pain in my life that I had no idea what to do. I literally had no idea what to do. And so one of the things that I was doing was I had mentioned I couldn't sleep at night. And so for me, what I was doing was I was living in Boston at the time. And Boston's it's a nice city, but it's also on the border of some cities and neighborhoods that aren't so nice. And I remember one of the things that I would do for about a period of like 3-4 weeks, I was just like, you know what? Life is very painful. I just can't do this. And so I was straight up just trying to fantasize about ending my life. And what I would do is I would go for like walks at like 1 a.m., 2 a.m. in like the hood, in like very dangerous neighborhoods, to just like try to imagine like just someone walking up to me and like trying to mug me and like kill me because I just couldn't live my life anymore. And so I did that for about a period of 3-4 weeks because I was truly just surrounded in so much darkness. And like I said, like it felt like my brain broke. I couldn't think anymore. And I remember on one of those nights, I was walking and I was like looking down, and I remember I was crossing like an interstate highway bridge. So normally during the day, if you were walking through this bridge, you would look down and then you would see like, an 8-lane highway system, very loud, all kinds of cars. But I remember walking through this bridge and then hearing a strong sense of like silence. And it was almost as if like someone took a remote control and hit the mute button, hit the no sound button. So it was like a very eerie sense of no silence, of no sound. And I remember when that happened and I heard that silence, I remember looking up and just kind of like looking around and seeing that like there were no cars in the street. There was nobody. I wasn't being distracted on my phone. There were no distractions. And like in that moment, I'm not exactly sure what really happened, but I had this moment of clarity to where I was just like, wait, what the hell am I doing here? Like, why am I walking in the middle of the street at 2 a.m. hoping for someone to like kill me? And when I had that moment, it was like a very, I don't know how to describe it. It was like a very, like mystical experience, like if you believe in God, if you believe in the universe, this is definitely where that was shining in. And I remember when I experienced that, I was just like, wait, what am I doing? And I remember just running back to my apartment. And I remember running back to my apartment, and that was like one of the first few moments for me where I sort of realized what was happening. Because what I didn't know at the time is that when I was in that moment, I had no idea. I was like locked and stuck in a trance. And there's like this quote that says, you can't see the picture when you're the one in the frame. And prior up to that moment, I had no idea that like social anxiety was a real thing. I had no idea that mental health was a real thing. And I just thought that there was something like wrong with me. I just thought that like I was some like moral failure from God. And it really wasn't until I started to go down this line of thinking of like, oh, maybe like it's the issue is not with me. Maybe there's an issue like with my brain. Maybe there's an issue with my mind. And so that for me was like the first moment of awareness that like slowly got me to work my way up out of there. And then when it came to like publicly speaking, professionally speaking, in terms of like owning my story and what you said. So I started a podcast in 2017 and it was called Humans 2.0. And on that show, I simply started it just for myself to learn. And I just started to interview all sorts of different kinds of experts, whether they were entrepreneurs or like neuroscientists or doctors or authors. just for my own like self-development, just different topics that I was interested in. And so I had been doing that podcast and I had interviewed over 300 people, or like by that time it was 200 people, had done over like 500 episodes. My podcast ranked in like the top 100 next to like NPR and Gary Vee and Tim Ferriss and all these cool people. And I just reached a moment. I was posting on LinkedIn too, but I was never really talking about my story. And it really wasn't until people just started to ask me. They're like, "Hey, Mark, you've interviewed like, hundreds of people about their stories, but like, what about you? Like, what's up with you?" And so people just started to ask me, and I had listened to enough people's stories on my podcast that I was like, you know what? I think I actually do have like a very specific thing that I can contribute to the world that's not really being covered. And so it was just through like that gradual process of like my own personal journey, dealing with my own like mental health and my own life, to then starting a podcast, using that to learn, getting access to like some of the top storytellers in the world and leaders, and listening to their story. And then eventually, slowly but surely, I just started to like, slowly share and like drip out, my story, whether it was on social media or on my podcast, and then eventually on stages. So it was a very gradual process. But it was one of those things where I was like, oh, I can do this too. That makes sense.
Yeah, no, I love it, because as you're talking, I'm thinking, I'm envisioning the prodigal son, right? The prodigal son, and not in the sense that you went out and did whatever he did, but there came a point where he found himself in that cone of silence. It's a in between this world and the next. Basically, it's so eerie, the silence, that it's like none other that you could ever experience on earth. So that's why I say it's that in between. But it's when you can get a hold of your senses. The world is so busy. It's so noisy. It happened to me the other day, Mark. I'm telling my wife, I come home and she goes, "What's wrong?" I said, "I don't want to be here no more." And she goes, "What?" I said, "I don't want to be on this earth no more." And it's not I want to commit suicide. It was I want to be with my father. I'm not from here. I want to be home. And it's that pulling, and it's not a bad thing. It's just it when God designed a time for you, it pulls you. And you have to go through a turmoil at times to understand that silence. But that silence bridges you over. Now, not everybody runs home from that silence, right? Not everybody does like me and say, it's not that I want to do anything to myself here on earth. No, I'm going to live to 100 years old, right?
Yeah.
But I just long to be with my father so much that I miss it. I miss it. I long it. So, you hit
It's so important.
that cone of silence where reason comes to play. And in the sense of the prodigal son, he says, "What am I doing? I am eating what pigs are eating. And in my house, my father's house, there are servants that are eating better than me. I'm going back to my father's house." Right? It was that moment of reason where, after that, we talk about it, right? He greeting
Yeah.
his son. He runs to him, he puts the ring on him, puts a robe on him. He's like, "Kill the fattened calf," right? It's just those things that come after. And so how I see it for you is that, you decided, I'm going,
Yeah.
and God opened the door, right? So wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love that. And I think that's great. And I've never actually heard that before. So I definitely learned something here. And I think too, like one of the biggest things that piggybacks off what you're saying is that So personally for me, like like my parents are, like super religious. And so I grew up going to church every single Sunday. However, I honestly don't really think that it ever connected with me. Never, the spirituality point never connected. But I think like there's such a like that's so bad, because the reality is that, like, kind of similar to what you said, of like there's two different worlds. And a lot of the times, like when you're born in this planet, and depending on your environment, depending on what you hear from other people, you think that this world is the only thing that exists. And you're just like sort of wandering. And the issue with that is that that's false. There are more than one world that exists. And like I think that humans are deeply spiritual. I think that's the only reason why we are where we are in our society, and how we've advanced. And that means that there is something deeper than what you see out of your eyes. And I think that's one of the biggest things that I, learned of, like, life is not just what you open your eyes and whatever your brain sort of tells you. Because like I'm someone who went through, like suicide and depression, where like your brain starts to mess with you. You start to, like, I don't want to say you see things that aren't there. It's not like I was hallucinating, but you see the world in like literally a darker place. And if you think that like this is your home, this is all where you belong, and you don't see anything or feel anything deeper than this sense of reality, that when you open your eyes, that's a straight up recipe for depression and nihilism, which is like terrible, which I think leads a lot of people to suicide, of like, life has no meaning. Why does it matter? And that's very dangerous. And I think that's happening a lot. And people, I think a lot of people haven't made that connection. So I totally agree with you. I think that's a super important point. And thank you for sharing that. I definitely learned something.
Yeah, no, I'm happy that you mentioned, it's amazing when you get to that point, how silence overpowers natural noise, ambient noise,
Hmm.
things that you can't control, right? You hear the wind, you hear the sea roaring, you see your cars are going. These are actual sounds, but this particular silence drowns that out, and it's louder than the noise around you, and it's
Hmm.
amazing. And so, no, I'm just happy you got there. We're talking to get today because you got there, and so I'm so fortunate. Now, listen, we're talking about leadership and human connection, because our stories get us to a point where we can actually now connect with someone else. I happen to be, I would say, blessed since being a child, to be, an extrovert. I'm just, I'll talk to anybody. I get along with most everybody. I mean, even those that I can't get along with because they just won't allow it. I'm like, hey, I still pray for you. I still pray for
Yeah.
you. I'm good. I'm good on my end. It's just sad that we can't get along. So, there's because there's some of that, and we're not everybody's cup of tea.
Yeah.
So, and when you realize that, you can live life a whole lot easier. But you started connecting through this story that you realize, hey, no, I got one. And how did that pan out for you, right? When you say, okay, let me step this thing out because I'm an introvert, and now I got this story to tell, but if I don't tell it in the right, context or whatever. And so how did that start off for you, that first step? What did you feel?
Yeah. So for me, like, I think one of the biggest things that I did that like really changed the course of my life was um the summer after, or like after I just talked to you about my dark moment in 2015, the leading months after that, I remember for the summer I went home to my parents' house. And one of the things that I did was like, and again, at that time, I had no idea what just happened. Like, I was very confused. I was like, what just happened? But all I know is that what happened, I don't want that to happen again. And so, like, for me, instead of me spending like my summer just like playing video games and staying up all night watching TV shows, doing God knows what, partying, doing things I probably shouldn't be doing. I was just like, you know what? Let me spend this entire summer to just learn. So I remember that summer, I just spent it learning, reading books, all different topics, all different ways. And for me, like what was really important was just like learning what it actually means to be an introvert. And if you look at like the psychology definition of what it means to be an introvert, all an introvert means is that the way that your brain is naturally programmed, it has a tendency to focus more on your internal world, your thoughts, your feelings, your emotions, pattern recognition, themes. And so a lot of the times, like if you can get someone who's an introvert and they know how to use their mind, they can be unstoppable. They're very, very, very powerful. But the issue is that a lot of us are not really taught how to use our minds. And if you're not taught how to use your mind, it could be very overwhelming. And if you have, any sort of like past traumas in your past, that can really, really control your life and bring you a lot of issues and conflicts. And so for me, what was really powerful was just learning like, oh, an introvert doesn't mean that I have a problem talking with people. It means that like I'm living in this bubble in my head, and you need to do certain things to get out of that bubble and then communicate what's in your bubble to everyone else's bubble and step into the bigger bubble, so to speak. And so that was one of the biggest things for me. And on top of that, like once I learned that, I also learned that like, oh, the problem that I have to where when I'm in a classroom or I'm in a room or I'm with my family or I'm talking to whoever, when I'm sitting there and like, there's like this feeling in my body, in my nervous system that tells me to not talk or makes me feel like, oh, I'm like a little kid in a room full of adults. That's not being an introvert. That is social anxiety. And so for me, I had to look at like the science, the like health aspect of like, what's happening in my brain? Because my brain is just a machine and it copies whatever happened in the past. And so, I was alive, for, 2 decades or whatever. And if you don't manage your mind, then eventually like your brain will be dysfunctional, because the same way that like you have thoughts, like if you have a thought, what's actually also happening is that your brain is firing electricity through a path of like neurons and neurotransmitters, very complex like neuroscience stuff. And what happens is if you do the same thing for 10 years, that gets hardwired into your brain, that gets hardwired into your nervous system. So that even if you think differently, even if you want to do differently, you still can't. You're still going to find yourself falling into the same paths. And so for me, what was really important is understanding that difference between an introvert, but then also looking at the science of social anxiety and figuring out like, how can I reverse this very real issue in my brain that is not letting me be myself? And what happened, I kind of said this before, was that when that happened to me, that completely changed my entire life, because my entire life, I had no idea that mental health, social anxiety was a real thing. And so every time when I was a kid and I was in school and I didn't act like myself, I wasn't able to speak up. Every time that happened, I would just think to myself, oh my God, Mark, you're so stupid. You're messed up. There's something wrong with you. You're just never going to be able to talk to people. Maybe you need to try harder. When I discovered social anxiety is real and I started to take the steps and I started to see improvements, I was like, oh, there's nothing wrong with me as a person, but there is an issue with my brain as a result of like my history and my historical context and my genetics and my experiences. So when that happened, it totally shifted the aim for me, because then it was just all about shaming myself, which didn't bring me anywhere. It didn't take me anywhere. And if anything, it just brought me down. And then it went to like, oh, this is like a science medical thing that I need to deal with, because it's actually getting in the way of how I was actually born and how I was actually created. And so that for me was like one of the most powerful like concepts that I unveiled, and it made me get to the root cause. And then all of a sudden, once I started to do that and then change my habits and live my life in that accordance, all of a sudden, like my social anxiety went from 95%, 100% controlling my life to now like it's kind of like there in the back of my mind, and maybe controls me like 5% of the time. And then I'm able to 95% of the time be myself and step into my power. And so that for me was like one of the biggest things that I had no idea. Nobody ever taught me that. I had to really figure it out on my own. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that got me kind of out there and stepping into that.
Well, it seems like awareness was the key to liberation, and it is in most things. Once you become aware, you can actually do something about it. And so you took the right
Yes.
road, the right approach at educating yourself so that you can get to the point where you could say, you know what, this is mine to deliver. I have to get a hold of whatever this is. I'll educate myself, and now I can actually say, okay, you there. Okay, I see you, but you're not going to control me, right? And that was the most empowering thing you could have done out of all the summers that you've lived, in your life. That was probably the most effective summer, because it really did put you in a position where you could say, yeah, I understand you're there. I see you, but I also am going to handle you accordingly to the best of my life. And that's usually so. If there's a leader out there listening, and you're in that realm, and you need help with awareness, both Mark and I can get you there. But it's where you need to get. You have to get to self awareness so that you can understand what you're dealing with, and then also help others understand how to deal with you. Because as we're talking, Mark, about leadership, and you're explaining this whole ordeal for you and this whole process for you, I'm thinking about the leaders that see this in their people but don't know how to deal with it.
Mm.
Because number one, they're not self-aware, right? So no,
Yeah.
they don't even know that they have tools in their own self to help. But then they don't even go farther than that to try to understand the people, the complement of the team members that they have, whether if they can identify some of these things without a person telling them that they're going through it, they at least can approach them in a way where they can help them out. And that's the true reason a leader is there. It's not to
Mm.
throw orders around, it's to help the team with who they are and how they operate to get the results that the company is trying to get, the organization is trying to get. So how have you seen, and focusing more on leadership now, how have you
Mhm.
seen leadership's pluses and negatives in this area? Because I know that we have a lot
Yeah.
of struggle at the level, the leadership level, when it comes to this.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. And it's definitely a huge conversation. And um I think number one, like going back to what you said, like awareness, I think that's really, really important, So the awareness of not just like looking at what is like what you can see on the surface, but trying to go deeper, right? So for example, like if you're a teacher in a classroom, right, and there's like one kid who keeps like interrupting you, he may seem very rude, he keeps talking, he's loud, you could easily just say, like, hey, that's like a troubled kid. He needs to go to detention, or he needs to go to this special school. And that may be required in certain cases. But if you look deeper, what you actually realize is like, hey, this kid has never been loved by his parents. His parents yell at him all the time. And the only way that he actually feels seen, that he gets attention, is by creating trouble. So for him, he's not doing that because he's a bad person. That's just the only way that he's learned how to communicate attention and love. And so I think like that always exists in every situation of like, there's the surface level, then there's the deeper level, right? So if and last Sunday I was in New York City, and there's not that many homeless people, but I remember walking through and seeing a homeless person, right? And I remember before, when I was like maybe a teenager, I was just like, oh, those people are messed up, for whatever reason. But then you look into it and it's like, oh, they have undiagnosed mental health problems as a result of life trauma, and they're trying to self-medicate with drugs. So you sort of go from like, oh, this is a terrible person, or like they do this for like some simple reason. But then when you look down, or excuse me, if you go a little bit deeper, there's always all sorts of causes. So I think that is a big, big, big aspect when it comes to it, because I think a lot of times as humans, one of our issues is we see people like static characters. So like the same way that like if we're watching a movie and there's like this kind of a specific character, he's like the protagonist or the antagonist or the villain or the hero, we see those people in our lives as just like a static sort of rock stone character. But then you have to ask, like, how did they get there? Like, people are not static. They have gone through different evolutions. They've gone through different things that have led them to be where they are. And so I think just sort of pausing and taking a deeper look and being like, hey, this person, like maybe they're not just this kind of person. Maybe they don't just act like that for whatever reason. Maybe there is a specific reason why they do act like that. And maybe there are things that I can do as a leader to just be more mindful and aware and like not do it. So for example, like, I remember being a kid and obviously I had no idea I had social anxiety. People around me had no idea I had social anxiety. So I'm not saying this from like a judgmental point of view. But like for example, I had different teachers and different leaders in my past where they would like force me to talk. And again, like, I think that's fine for most people. But for example, for someone like me, I literally couldn't talk, and my nervous system would put me into fight or flight, and I would just look down and just freeze and not talk. And then the teacher would take that personally, and they would say, "Oh, Mark, why aren't you talking? Like, I'm gonna, you're not gonna get a good grade for all this stuff." When it's like, maybe instead of doing that, maybe instead of like ask them in front of the entire group, maybe you can just have a one-on-one with them and just try to talk with them. And then maybe they're much more likely to give you the answer, right? So a lot of this, I think, is you have to sort of like drop the, what I would say, like ego, in terms of you thinking you know everything about everyone and why people act the way they do. You have to go deeper. You have to understand that people are not static characters. They had to go through things to get them to where they are. And then don't force like your communication style. Don't force the way that you do things on people whose brains, whose histories, whose nervous systems may be incompatible with your leadership style, And so I know I said a lot there, but I think those three things are very, very important, especially, as we enter in this world more where, sort of mental health is coming more to the forefront. People are becoming more aware of that. And so all of that is very, very, very important, and so I think that is a huge thing. And I think just like every industry, I also think leadership is going through its own, revolution. It's going through its own thing of like, one size fits all. If you don't do this, you're fired or whatever. To like, hey, going back to what you said, like, how can leaders work with people to help them develop their own lives, their own skills? And then if you do that, then they're gladly willing to pour that back into the company, into the boss, into the leader that help them with themselves. And so I think that's super, super important.
Yeah, and I agree with you that a lot has happened simultaneously across the world. So this is one of the last year and a half has been one of the few things that we all as a human race at one given time have had to go through. But the impacts on the mind are there. And so what I've been encouraging leaders to do is to not think that they're getting the same people back into the offices, because things have changed. For if somebody was like, okay, Enrique, I know that you had such great success in the Navy. I want you to come in, after this last year and a half and give me the same thing. Well, guess what? I lost family members because of COVID. I've lost friends because, so there's been a something happened to Enrique that has not happened in all his life. There's been something that happened to every single human being on this earth at one time that has never happened in a long time, because it did happen before, but those people most of them are gone. But so leaders need to be conscious of the fact that things are not the same and you cannot operate the same. It's time to turn on that heart and start connecting with people, which is what we've been talking about, right? That human connection. And so, Mark,
Yeah.
you've done a lot of great strides to get into and overcome. How can somebody get a hold of you to kind of get some of that advice that you took on and help them, whether they're leaders or they're just an introvert trying to figure it all out, or somebody that's in between?
Yeah. So, before that, just real quick, what you said, I love what you said before. And I have a friend of mine, his name is Dan Chabelle. He's a New York Times bestselling author, huge, and runs all kinds of studies across workplaces. And his team recently put out a study that showed throughout all the organizations and companies across the world in America, the biggest people who have actually struggled for their mental health is actually leaders. And like, that's huge, because if you're a leader, you're constantly giving, you're expected to listen to people's problems, but you're also a human. So like, that also can weigh a lot on you.
Yep.
And so what I would say too, is like, this should also be a wake up call to leaders, and be like, of course, sometimes you need to sacrifice. Of course, sometimes you need to serve other people before yourself. But also you need to realize that you really do need to serve yourself and take care of your mental health, or else you're not going to be able to be yourself, God forbid, in the future. And so that's very important. So I think it's super, super important. So for people looking to contact me, the best place is just my website, which is just my first and last name.com. It's markmetry.com. And yeah, the best place is, if you go to my website, there will be an email box. And if you put your email in that box, you'll be subscribed to my email newsletter, where every week I send out like 2-3 purely educational, informational articles, resources, all about this stuff. And if you get an email from me, you can reply directly to that email and it'll go directly to me. And I always respond to all of those emails. So I highly recommend people to reach out to me, check out my book, anything I've got going on. Always feel free to reach out. This is what I do for my life. So, it's an honor. It's my purpose.
Outstanding. And we love it. So thank you for sharing that with us. We'll make sure that it's part of the video show notes and any information so they can get a hold of you. Mark, it's been a true pleasure to sit down and chat with you. This cannot be the last time.
Nah.
But I tell you that, and for those leaders that are listening, times have changed. Get ready, brace yourself, but fill up first, because you can't give what you don't have. You have to fill up. And if you need help, hey, reach out. We're ready. We're ready to help you. It's not going to be blasted to the world, right? So it's just that it's so important for you to be up and up when you're returning back, especially in group settings that people are asking folks to come back. But realize that we're not the same as we were a year and a half. So you have to get smart on that. Mark, thank you so much. Any parting words from you before we go?
Dude, thank you for making my Wednesday. That's all I could say, man. You're a great person. I hope people reach out to you, and I hope you continue to rise in your success and help other leaders, man. And you are doing it. So I'm proud of you, and keep going.
Thank you so much for that. Hey, folks, thanks for being with us. And as we like to close the show, success to you.